everyone, and welcome to the Truth and Data podcast, where each week we tackle a different digital forensics topic. I'm Jessica.
I'm Kim.
And I'm Debbie.
So this week we're going to be talking about testing. So my very first question, I got to push this to Jessica because this is coming up in so many of your trials.
Yeah, so every single case I've been working recently, and I've had a lot of Daubert hearings and trials.
Which, tell us what that is for those folks who may not know.
So a Daubert hearing, or the Daubert standard, is basically you're stating, is this item suitable for evidence in layman's terms? And there's actually 6 or 7, depending on how you look at the definition, principles that have to be met. And one of them is that this is accepted science. And so we're talking about the scientific element of what we're doing and what we do in digital forensics. So what's coming up is, and this is the crux of what I feel our jobs are as digital forensics examiners, and I know there's lots of parts of what we do, but I think the crux of what we do is provide the meaning to the data. The tools can parse it all day long, the tools can find it all day long, but we have to provide the meaning. And most recently, what really came up that probably many listeners know about, and now that that case is closed and adjudicated, I'll mention this episode is not on this case, but I'm speaking specifically about testing. But in the Karen Reed trial, one of the questions of evidence was that a tool had parsed out a URL, and it had an associated time date stamp. And the question is, what is the relationship between that URL and that timestamp? That needed to be tested. I've had several other cases that revolved around geolocation artifacts. I've had, and the question is what causes that geolocation artifact? And I mean, scores of cases actually recently around geolocation artifacts. Our whole company has been getting a lot of geolocation artifact cases from a lot of mobile devices. And in order to answer these questions, we can't just rely on the fact that a tool parsed something. We need to test. And there are ways to test. Anybody who's been through our mobile forensic analysis course is familiar with our truth process, and we have this whole recreate and unearth steps, and then translating, and those whole middle steps, those are around conducting testing to understand what the data means. And that is really a core functionality. As far as I'm concerned, if it's something I have to testify to, I need to test if I understand it. And that's my key I'm trying to throw out there and teach people now. Because too often we rely on what the tool presents to us, and we're assigning meaning. And when I say we're, I don't mean myself, I mean as a community. We're assigning meaning based on what it is presumed to mean or what we've been told it means. But to be honest, what we're not doing is ensuring what else could cause it. So in a lot of instances, something can be caused by a certain actions can cause a piece of art. I'm going to break this down, go way back, all right? Roll back, all right? In our job, we're looking at evidence, right? Trace evidence. And applications that run on computers or phones or IoT devices or servers or whatever we're analyzing were not meant to keep logs for the purpose of evidentiary court proceedings. Our science, digital forensics, is looking at what residue is left by actions people take on electronically storage media, right? On digital devices. And our job is to find what little things are left behind. But it's not just to find them, it's to say what could have potentially caused them. So let's say I'm a developer and I'm going to completely leave computer forensics for the realm. Basically, if somebody walks through the mud in a pair of shoes, right? I'm talking about that track, right? And I'm identifying what kind of shoe was it? What size shoe was it? And then sometimes things get weird. People try to delete it. It rains, right? Now I can kind of see that maybe there was a shoe that walked through it, but now I can't tell if it was a person or an animal. I have to go, what could have caused that footprint? So in order to figure out what could have caused that footprint, I can't presume it's the always reason that the only thing that causes that footprint is the thing that maybe the program designed to. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does.
It's a good analogy.
So what winds up happening is in an evidentiary hearing, we're getting asked, what does this mean? And is this something that is accepted? The problem is that we don't have enough scientific literature covering every single artifact, right? There's over 6 million apps that exist. Not 6 million apps are parsed by your tools, and even the things that are parsed by your tools are constantly changing. And just because something has a colloquial nomenclature, or it's what it's called in the data storage, that's being factual to how the data is stored. How the data is stored and what an algorithm parses doesn't tell you what it means or how it potentially got there. So not only do we have to test the way things normally function, but we have to say, what are all the other reasons this artifact could exist? And we have to create tests to do that. So that winds up putting you in a couple of different phases, right? You need to figure out what is your test environment, right? Are you going to test on hardware? Are you going to test on software? You need to figure out where you're going to test. Is this going to be emulated? Is this going to be something, do I need to obfuscate my home or my work address from this data set because I may have to share it? And you maybe go and share what? I'm going to tell you, I have been compelled in court to share data sets, and I have had to retract data sets to share in court in Daubert hearings. And that has happened to me in the last 6 months. So in the last 6 months, I have had to produce my test data to the court. Ironically, not things I even tested for the court. So this means that we need to be doing our testing and expect our testing now, not just our analysis, our testing to be challenged and looked at in an adversarial hearing. This is important to understand. It means that we need to make sure that our testing plans are well documented. There is a guideline from NIST-DOSAC, the Data Set Generation Guidelines that were put out in 2022. I was part of the subcommittee that worked on those data set generation guidelines, along with other great examiners and folks from NIST. So Barbara Gutman, Jim Lyle, Connie Bell, Josh Hickman, who creates a lot of test images. And that is a fantastic document at giving you some guidelines as to how to create just your test data set. And it's interesting because you want to be anonymous if you have to share, but there are things you can't make anonymous. So then what do you do? Right? And there are things where it's hard to create the data. There are things where the app might be a foreign app and somebody has to recommend you for the app. And now you are like, how do I get recommended to have a WeChat account? And then put a synthetic profile on it.
Or it's going to be very difficult for you to actually recreate that because it was something that was kind of a one-off or something that odd that happened. Look, we don't get the keys to the kingdom when it comes to, oftentimes we don't get whoever made the operating system or the application. They're not going to tell us everything that occurs in the code that is going to make data reside somehow.
But they don't know it
all the time.
But Kim, they don't know it. So I got asked that on the stand twice recently in 2 different cases. What my thoughts were on having access to the code. Like, can't you not? So a lot of the Daubert challenges I've been facing recently is, can't you not speak to that because you don't have access to the code? and actually my argument is the code doesn't tell me what artifacts are left behind. There's a lot of other things in the system that cause artifacts to be left behind, and the developers develop in order for something to meet a specific process. We've all had bugs happen that we experience in code when we're as users. So lots of those types of elements can cause things that, like you said, the one-offs can cause all kinds of other trace evidence. Those are things I can test for. I can test and prove how data winds up residing and living and demonstrate that to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. Whereas looking at the code, I mean, anyone who develops knows if you look at your old code, you can't tell exactly what it did. Even, and then you take code that's not being worked on by just one person, but thousands of people, if we're talking like Apple or the Android code base, and different parts interact with different parts, and that's what causes artifacts. So I don't think having access to the code, it could be helpful, but I think that testing is much more critical and allows us to have a better sense of what causes an artifact to reside, right? When you do malware analysis, there's dynamic analysis and static analysis, and the best option is to have and do both. And we do have access to some of the code, the programming, right? But no, we don't necessarily have access to proprietary algorithms. But what we can test is when we do X, what becomes the residual data Y? And when we do Z, what becomes the residual data Y? So it's building a robust enough test to both include the scenario under test, but also what other things could have changed and caused is important. And we need to document those things. Now, the problem is a lot of folks will tell you, I don't have time. So Debbie, what do you do if I come to you, and I'm going to say this is seriously a lot of what I'm doing in casework is a lot of testing. If I come to you and say, so I have this situation, and it's gonna. I know we've got this case, and I don't know what's causing this particular geolocation, but I know it was on this version of Android device, on this Samsung device. Can I buy that device, and B, can I go take a car, go off site with that device, test for 30 hours, and then use one of our credits that we have in order to get our extractions, to get a full file system extraction and see what the data is. And oh, by the way, I actually need to test this each day for 7 days to see what changed.
So, I trusted my examiners. I trusted my examiners, and, I am not a trained examiner, so I had to trust them. I would probably ask a few questions. Is there an easier way for us to do this as an executive? And if there's not, and it needs to be done, then yes, the answer is yes. But those are all legitimate questions. I know executives, I was at a disadvantage. I learned a lot from the examiners that I supervised. I asked a lot of questions, and it took time for me to understand. And I was always amazed, honestly, at how long cases took. I had to learn why that happened, and that was normal. I guess maybe I'll sort of ask you something sort of along the same vein, but how do you, both of you, explain to law enforcement executives who may not understand digital forensics why testing is important and why it takes so long? They want things done fast, and they're pressured by other entities about why isn't this done yet and things like that. How do you explain to executives why this is important, and I guess all the aspects of it?
So
I think one thing that's hugely important is to be able to adequately explain it, which that you just said, how do you explain it? That goes along with it is that you yourself need to be able to break it down in terms of explaining to them in a way that they know, that they can understand it. Maybe it's an analogy. Maybe it's sitting down with them and showing them exactly. Maybe it's for you to say, look, this is what I see here. This is really important, but I don't know how it happens. So walking it back a few steps for them to be able to understand it, have them walk in your shoes and understand that it's not always going to be obvious to you. And that's where you're doing a lot of this.
But here's the other thing too. Sometimes, Kim, I even get nervous, I'm being honest, sharing, hey, so I see this thing and I don't know what it means. I need more time, because sometimes they accidentally get really excited about that thing I showed them and they make the misassumption, and then they're already like going to town with it and they're telling up the chain, and I'm like, whoa, hold. I see this has a timestamp on our day of interest, right? Whatever it is. This chat message has a timestamp on our day of interest. But this data is in an unparsed, no commercial tool parses it, and it's in a protobuf that's inside an NSKey archived plist that was inside the blob.
That's where you're going to lose them.
SQLite database. And I don't know what the heck it caused it. But I'm not trying. I'm intentionally letting them know the truth, which is that it is deep and complex. And I came across this, and it is on our date of interest, and it is in this app that we haven't looked at. But I don't know what caused it. And just because it's on our date of interest, and just because it's in this app, does not mean it is what people might assume it is. And that has been a big thing in a lot of casework is, I guess there's two big reasons you test. Both are easier to understand meaning, but one is an unsupported artifact, something that the tool didn't parse, and the other one is something the tool did parse. And just because the tool parsed it, and this is really, really critical, doesn't mean you don't need to test. Again, I'm going to say it. If you have to testify, you better testify, understand it, because that's the standard, is that we have to show. Now, we're going to take it one step further. The other question is going to be, is there peer-reviewed literature on this? And that's part of the problem in our field that has so much and is so rapidly evolving. I will strongly advocate for people to put things through DFIR review, especially as the chair of that project, which looks at practitioner-created blogs and puts them through a peer review process. But something I've had trouble articulating on the stand, and that I keep getting asked, or maybe I didn't have trouble articulating it, but I feel like the message is hard for people to receive, is that typically something to get published, a requirement of being published, is that the item is novel. Meaning no one else has written about it, or it has significantly changed since somebody else has written about it. And one of the things that I've gotten asked in Daubert hearings is, well, why isn't there more than one piece of peer-reviewed literature on this? Or there's only one journal. And I'm like, yes, but that means that there were multiple peer reviewers, so multiple people peer-reviewed that article from a journal or DFIR review. In DFIR review, you can see how many and who. In a journal, you can't see how many or who, but know that it's definitely 2 or more, most likely 3 or more. People have actually done a peer review. It's gone through cycles of revisions and secondary questioning. But the point being is that there's typically is only going to be one article, if there's any. And so this is an issue, right? And things need to be tested to make sure we understand the meaning. Because just because that URL has a timestamp next to it doesn't mean it's the time it was searched. It could mean something else. Just because that geolocation exists in your database, doesn't mean that geolocation was a location the phone was at. There are lots of databases that store other information about geolocation. So the whole point is just because we see an artifact, we need to, it is our job, it is our responsibility to figure out why it is there. If not, Okay, if it was not for the fact that we had to figure out artifacts that are unsupported, how they got there and what that result is, or understand why something that was parsed by your tool got there and what caused it, we'd have no jobs. We could be replaced by computers. We are the ones who go up on the stand and speak to what those results mean. Jessica, is this entire episode you just advocating for people to test? Yes. And there is guidance. There isn't as clear guidance as I'd like on this, but some things you could look at is you could look at DFI or Reviews Matrix and what the reviewers are asked to do. So the reviewer guidance is on there, and you can be doing that if you're looking at somebody else's article that's a blog, and you're following the guidance in their blog as to what an artifact means. You should be testing it, and then you tested the blog. So there was a blog and there was your testing. For your data set generation, you should be following the NIST OSAC guidance, which is the data set generation guidelines. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes. For the foundation of how you test and the questions and removing biases, there's great information in a NIST Scientific Foundations paper on digital forensics. That actually is a really interesting paper when we're talking about Daubert, because that is the paper that defines digital forensics itself as a science that is rooted in computer science. And actually there's some really good stuff in there that'll help you if you're on the stand and you're responding to questions about your testing. There's some really good information in there about statistical analysis and why that is not the appropriate measurement for digital forensic testing and analysis. So those things together, I feel like you have to piece them all together to understand. We have a free micro course on testing on the Hexordia site. I almost forgot about that.
I was going to mention that.
I forgot about it. I wrote it. But just on testing methodologies for mobile forensics, that'll give you some. But the reason that that's there and free is because it is that important. I don't know how to stress it anymore, but we need to test. And if I'm not the only person out there who's getting Daubert challenges, right? I'm not the only person who's working Daubert challenges in court. Everyone is. So we should be, if you're doing something and you're showing the initial triage analysis and a tool parsed out something, and that is shown, you show that to counsel, and counsel shows that to opposing counsel, and somebody pleads, great. You don't need to go through those steps. But if it's going to court, you need to be certain about what you're putting there, what you're putting in that report, what you're saying that data is. I know something we do at Hexordia is a lot of times we'll do a preliminary report of, in a few hours and say, this is what we'd still need to test. And we provide that report and say, this is what we found. We found it here, but we're not ready to provide what that means. In order to provide that meaning, we have to test. And I'd say there's nothing wrong with doing that in a report. And we often leave that up to the customer. Would you like us to do further analysis or not about that? And, we're doing that to be respectful of people's funding, but we're also trying to, make sure that we're not saying something means something that we don't. If that makes sense.
Sure. One of the things you mentioned was about versions and versioning. So when it comes to doing this testing, we've got a couple of different ways that we need to make sure that we're complying with testing or with versioning, right? So we've got this from a hardware perspective and a software perspective, right?
Yeah. So hardware, software matter sometimes matter more in some instances than in others, right? You want to try, optimally, you'd want everything to be the same. But for example, you can't roll back an iOS device, so that introduces a complexity. Luckily, actually, I was bringing this up to Debbie on a case I was working, and Debbie shared with me about EcoATM. Debbie, can you share about EcoATM real quick, just so that folks know about that?
Absolutely. EcoATM is a service basically where people can recycle their cell phones. And what they do with those cell phones, they do a variety of things, but they offer a service to law enforcement free, where if you need as an examiner, an exact match phone as a test device, or to repair another device. Say, it's broken. We just did the class with Jessa. So,
yeah, I
if you
stopped by.
need,
We were talking specifically about Echo ATM when I
yes.
stopped by the class Nick was teaching. Yeah.
So Eco ATM will provide you with an exact match phone. And I believe you got one that was the exact model of the phone with the exact operating system that you needed.
Yeah,
So
we did that in a case. And obviously I'm not law enforcement, so I'm not requesting them, but we do cases with law enforcement.
correct.
And so law enforcement had requested the exact make model test so that we could make sure that that was straight precisely for this purpose. But sometimes you cannot get the functionality sometimes on a newer device. And oftentimes we have cases that come up that are old. I testified in a case recently where, the act happened in 2015. It's 2025 and we're still in Daubert hearings. Sometimes we're dealing with older devices. So then how do you test an older device? And so actually getting your hands on an older device, sometimes those devices are no longer compatible with certain services. So sometimes you can't just test on that same make model. Optimally, you can test a version before and a version after as well to see if things changed or if they're the same. I would say the software version is more critical than the hardware if the hardware supports the software, like was in active support, but optimally you want a perfect match. I was very thankful to Eco ATM for being able to do that and the fact that they can help with that, and specifically that they can do versions. To be honest, from a purchasing perspective now of older devices, when we purchase things, we're purposely going through them as opposed to eBay and everything else because we know they help with casework and we respect that. So like our internal policy now is we go to them first. But at the end of the day, you want it as close to as you can. And oftentimes this may mean testing on multiple devices, potentially, right? Because especially if you can't get an exact match, you may want to do above and below. You want to be as close to as possible. Now for an application, the cool thing is on most mobile phones, the app is actually stored. And in most instances, we can actually take the app from the device and install that, sideload it on our test device. We actually have a good blog post on how to do that for iOS, because for Android it's pretty straightforward how you sideload an APK onto Android, onto your test device. But for iOS, it isn't as straightforward. And so we actually have a cool blog post that Nick Dubois from our team wrote, and it's called Brewing with IPAs, which is a wonderful pun. It's a nice beer pun, but you also use brew, and the packages that iOS uses, that's an app, like your equivalent of your EXE on a computer or your APK on an Android device is an IPA, so an iPhone app. And so I just love the pun. Anyone who knows me knows that I love a good pun, so I love the fact that Nick titled that Brewing with IPAs.
Perfect.
Why do you think I like writing CTFs? It's all about the puns. I'm joking. I'm half joking, but yeah.
I was about to say you're not joking.
I'm not joking. I love puns. It's my favorite part, actually. You do everything else, but so building test scenarios and your test profiles and a robust set of test devices is going to be critical, and it does take time. And Debbie, I'm glad that you acknowledged the time element, because it takes time to test, and not all tests can be done very quickly. And also I'm really big on live monitoring. If you haven't played with Evanol Community Edition, the whole goal of that is to live monitor on iOS while you're doing things. That tool is something we use in testing so that we can understand what's happening in the unified logs, what's happening in the syslogs, so that we can identify those artifacts and so that we can see what's happening live, which then helps us determine what's happening on the device afterwards. So I'm all about live monitoring of your devices as you're taking actions so that you can understand it. I'm really big on screen recording things that you're doing and the actions you're taking. Like, those are all things you can do to help yourself better understand the data. But at the end of the day, if you're not testing, how do you know what that data means? If you're saying that I'm just going to say the blunt thing. If in your report you're saying something is something, it was done at this time, it was deleted, it was searched, it was clicked on, whatever it was, how do you know if you didn't test? How do you know if you didn't test? What else could cause that artifact? And you have to ask that bias. What else could cause that artifact? I'm sorry, I did the Superman thing. I pulled my glasses off, so you know I was in a moment. Meant I couldn't.
You're totally serious. You were dialed in.
Yeah, but you. In other words, the thing that irks me the most is when a report says because Celebrite said so, because Axiom said so, because Oxygen said so, because Belkasoft said so. I'm sorry if I didn't mention your tool, because MSub said so, because any tool. And another thing is, just because something is parsed by multiple tools, it means it exists. It doesn't tell you what it means. And I think that's like the really big crux. Just because data is there doesn't mean it got there for the reason you wanted it to get there. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And wanted to means because it supports your assumptions. You need to go, what else could have caused that data to be there? And the only way to know is if you test. I'm going to emphasize again, if you're going to testify, you have to test if I know what it means.
I love it. I think that's awesome.
We need t-shirts.
I think, would you say, Debbie?
T-shirts. We need t-shirts.
I need a sticker.
Yep.
Yes.
Testify equals test if I.
So I think it's important for us on numerous reasons to remember that this is something that we need to do for testing, but we also need to look at this from the other perspective, because if we are to bring our results to the courts, for forensics, right? Mm-hmm. Then they need to be able to be replicated by a third party, right? So that goes along with your testing also. If you are presenting them to the court, which is what you'd said a moment ago, is that your test results have been reviewed or have been brought into court, right?
Yes. So I'm pulling up on Cornell the 5 parts of the Daubert standard. So I'm speaking about U.S. law, but the first one is whether the technique or theory in question can be and has been tested. If you're bringing this to court, either it has to have been... Now, if it's in a peer-reviewed article and you apply the methodology, technique, or theory, in theory, it has been tested, but has it been tested on your exec device? Number 2, whether it has been subject to publication and peer review. This is why, if you are finding something new, I am going to encourage you to send it through a peer review process. Please, 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 either send it through publication, through the journals, Journal of Forensic Science, which is under the AAFS conference, Forensic Science Investigations, Forensic Science International Digital Investigations Journal, which, disclosure, I used to be an associated editor for, DFRWS, the Digital Forensics Research Workshop. It no longer stands for that. No longer is an acronym. I've been corrected on this many times. But DFRWS, which does publish a US, EU, and an APAC conference every year, so 3 options for publication. The problem is those processes are a bit long. You can blog the content publicly and then submit it for DFIR review, which, again, disclosure, I chair. It is a subsidiary product of DFRWS. It is recognized. The next one is its known or potential error rate. That is discussed in the forensic science. In the foundations document. So I really encourage you to read it. The existence and maintenance of standards controlling its operation. So this is your controls that you use in testing versus what existed in the real world, and whether it has attracted widespread acceptance within a relevant scientific community. And that is as the rest of the digital forensics community look at it. So I would say something that's met that last one. I'm not an attorney. Hashtag, this is not legal advice, okay? Digital forensics practitioner experience. Is it something that's being taught in digital forensics curricula that is accepted community-wide? Would be our scientific community, right? Is this what's being taught at institutions, colleges, SANS classes, Sexordia classes, what have you? But those are the 5 things for a factor for an expert's methodology to be considered valid. So the Daubert standard is there, and we're going to see more and more Daubert hearings about evidence. So I just want to really, really stress that we need to test. Like, I don't know what else to say there. It is absolutely critical. It's one of the most important functions of our job. And if you don't think you're a scientist and you're working in digital forensics, you're wrong. You're a scientist. That's your job. You're a scientist. You have to use the scientific method to test things and explain what they are in court. That's what you're being relied upon to do. You are not a technician. A technician pushes a button on the tool and gets the result out. An engineer builds the tools and the products. A scientist applies theory, hypotheses, tests things, discovers new things, writes about them. You should consider yourself a scientist as a digital forensics examiner. And I don't know if everybody does.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of folks that come at this, and we've talked about, this profession from a couple of different perspectives, but I think there are a lot of folks that come at this profession from different ways, if you will. Some of them do have that scientific background, and they are from a computer science background, and some of them, maybe they've got a long history of a degree or not in maybe they came from law enforcement and they're not that technical of a person who had to kind of learn this. But at whatever reason or way that you ended up here, we're all doing the same thing. We are all doing the same thing.
It doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter if you came from a comp sci background or an engineering background or a technician background, or you were just taught. It is your responsibility, if you are going to testify as to what digital forensics evidence means, to utilize a scientific method to test and understand the things you are speaking to. Otherwise, you're never going to meet the Daubert standard to be able to produce it in court. And I apologize for that being a very U.S.-centric statement around Daubert. However, I think that it is still a globally recognized concept that we have to test in order to understand, we ensure what it means. And the second thing is, because of that publishing peer review requirement, I cannot express enough how much I encourage you to apply to be a reviewer, or if you're finding things, to blog them out and submit them to DFI review, or send them out for full peer review. I've done that. I've had content, be produced in peer review journals, but it's a longer process, and a lot of times we need the content out now. Please review. Please be a peer reviewer. And if you, I'm going to make a weird statement. Let's say professionally you found a blog and you tested it because you were applying it to your evidence. Please email DFI review at dfrws.org and tell us, because we can make you a reviewer for that. We can put that through the actual peer review process, have you write up your findings in accordance with the process, and help get that blog peer reviewed. Because if you did it, you're probably going to need it for court. And the sooner you do it, it's a process, because everybody is a volunteer, right? So let's just, work together, share our research. We're going to need to write, publish, and test more. And if you didn't think it was part of your job, surprise, it should be.
So
I think that goes.
So go ahead. I have a another executive law enforcement question. So we're talking about, say, you guys mentioned say a technician who maybe isn't trained to the level of an examiner who can test. There are many agencies that have people who are simply trained to operate tools,
Yeah.
and they are coming up with reports. What would your suggestion be to reach out to examiners to have an examiner that they can when needed refer cases to? What would be your suggestion there? Because not everyone has.
I love this question. So number one, there is absolutely a role for people who are doing acquisitions, doing processing, running those tools. There is the need for that to happen, and that is an important, necessary need. When there's a lot of different workflows that can happen in a lab, and in some labs you have somebody who works a case cradle to grave. So they receive the evidence, they go out even to the scene, they seize the evidence, they receive the evidence, they acquire the data from the evidence, they then process the data, they then analyze the data, they deep dive it, they do the testing, and then they report on it. That is not what happens in every lab. Some labs, somebody different is at the scene than the person who's at the lab, who then does the acquisition and the processing, who's different than the person who does then do the analysis, and that's fine. The issue is when something is, a report is created, let's say like a UFDR, a portable case, which is the parsed artifacts by the tool of something, and it's turned over to an investigator or an attorney. The investigator or attorney their responsibility is to work with the examiner. They find things of interest. They then need to work with an examiner and say, this is what we found of interest. What can you tell me more? And then to establish a scope and work with the examiner to figure out what needs to be done and what needs to be tested. Like, that is the responsibility. If there's something of interest, bring that of interest and inquire. And again, sometimes you can just present that to the opposing party and they go, yep, got it, yep. But the times when it is, again, if you're going to testify, right? If it's going to trial, right. If you know that this is the purpose of forensics, what is the definition of forensics, right? The definition of forensics means that we're looking at data stored on electronic storage media, whatever it could be, that is looking for evidence on that for the purposes of legal proceedings. If it isn't for the potentiality of legal proceedings, it isn't forensics by definition. It's just incident response. It's just data analysis. But if it has a potentiality for a legal proceeding, it is now in that digital forensic realm. And that is why we need to pay such close attention to putting correct meaning to things so that we're not making incorrect assumptions. And I think the How's Long to Die in Cold is a really good example of that, because the initial assumption that was presented in the first trial was that search had occurred at a specific time when testing of that artifact shows that particular artifact isn't a regular search history. It has to do with the most recently viewed item in a particular tab and when that tab moves from the foreground to the background. So that timestamp could be for a newly opened tab, or it could be for when a tab was backgrounded or foregrounded, but not necessarily, and it can be in the instance that you opened a new tab and there's only been one thing searched, it would be the time of search, but not always. And so we have to figure out and understand what those things mean. So that's just a good example because it's nice and clean and it's the case is over. But the thing is that you would never know that if you didn't test. If you just look at the report, obviously, the assumption would be that it was searched at that time because that's parsed by the results. And that's why I'm saying you should not say this is such, or this is deleted, or this is true because tool X said so. Because what is tool X using to derive that? Right. And maybe we could do an entire episode on the phrase deleted. I actually wrote a peer-reviewed paper with Drs. Owen Casey and Dr. Nelson about the definition of deleted. That is a really... it's a term that grinds my gears. I tend to speak in terms of recovered and what type of recovery was done, because to the layman, who is typically our trier of fact, is typically not a digital forensics or a computer science expert, to the layman, deleted implies that the user intentionally got rid of something. I had a case recently where, there was just all this surprise that there was all this data because the user had deleted it. And I'm like, well, yeah, when you delete it, you're just hiding it from yourselves, not us, right? But that term deleted to users, they think it's gone and not recoverable, and they think that it was a user action. And just because data shows as deleted in a database or a data store doesn't mean that a user took an action to remove it. And that's one of the other things we have to test, right? Because maybe a user could have, but is there something else that could cause it? And do we have evidence of which one caused that removal of evidence? And that is a big thing that's come up in cases that I've been working a lot recently too, is deletion and the definition of deletion. And I think that's another critical one. But yeah, let's do a whole episode on, is it deleted? Oh,
I love it.
Because that's a fun topic.
Oh yeah, I think it's a great topic as an examiner to talk about things, from the whole deleted terminology that's used.
You like one thing though, Mythbusters episode.
That's right. Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I love that.
I love it.
I love that.
Well, one thing that you mentioned, Jessica, that I think really sums up a lot of this is that you said, you talked about an artifact, and it's not just the artifact and what the content of it was in terms of, in that instance, the words that were searched, but it's the second part of the artifact also, with the date and timestamp that goes along with it. So there may be multiple portions of one artifact that you're trying to test or that you need to test in order to see the entire picture. So I think that really just shows the complexity. And
having a robust test plan, right? Because if you only test in that instance, if I search something in a new tab, does that timestamp and that URL appear? The answer is going to be yes. So your test has to include, well, what else happens? What happens if I switch tabs? What happens if I open a new tab? What happens if I close that application and open a new application? What happens if I if I update just the URL and stay on the same tab? What happens if I open that tab on another phone? What happens if I open it on an iPad or a Mac that is in that same Safari account? All of those things are, and that's just some of the questions off the top of my head that I know that were things that we tested. What does that show in other logs? What other artifacts should exist? What artifacts aren't existing at this moment? What could have caused that not to happen? Were there any unique circumstances involved in this particular incident that I'm not considering? And when I look at normal functionality, you have to explore all these things and include them in your test plan.
Absolutely.
And sometimes
I've loved this episode. Yeah. I think this is great.
Well, at any rate, thanks everyone. We hope you enjoyed, and we hope that you're going to test, and we hope we're going to submit things to peer review, and I hope you all have wonderful, successful Daubert hearings and that you get to produce good evidence in court. Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.